Hello, everyone. My name is Matthew Swift, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of Concordia. It is my great pleasure to introduce this upcoming session between two remarkable leaders representing both the public sector and the private sector. Nothing could connect more to Concordia's mission than this discussion coming up now. Featuring President Laura Chinchilla, the former president of Costa Rica, who has been a long-standing member of Concordia's Leadership Council and played an invaluable role as we've developed our Americas Initiative, which will include our next America Summit coming up in July of 2022. We are also going to be joined by Jay Collins, the Vice Chairman of Citigroup. Jay is one of our newest members of our Leadership Council, and he is a remarkable figure in the private sector, especially a leader when it comes to the environmental movement and the future of ESG reporting within the private sector. Most notably, he also has been leading on all financial related elements to the Gavi Alliance, which is bringing important vaccine distribution all around the world in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm grateful to these two leaders for being such an important, integral part of Concordia and in advancing our mission. And I hope you enjoy this upcoming conversation.
Hello, Jay. Congratulations on your appointment as one of the members of the Concordia Leadership Council. It would be great to have you among us. To kick off our conversation, tell me a little about why you are excited to join the Leadership Council.
Well, first of all, thank you. It's an extraordinary organization, and I've attended the UN General Assembly meetings for so long, as you know, and just realized that, that Concordia is at the center of a lot of those meetings. And Matt Swift and I met, and he started to ask me to speak on ESG, on refugees, on things that were near and dear to me. We had some quiet sessions, very interesting, on 5G, on Venezuela and other themes. And I just think that it's extraordinarily impactful. But most of all, when Matt came to me and showed me who was on the Leadership Council, and I saw your name, Madam President, I couldn't resist.
No, thank you. Thank you so much. For sure, we will gain a lot with you more involved with the Concordia initiative. Let me go over some issues of concern nowadays, and mostly considering your work advising governments for the last 30 years. I imagine that you participated at Davos and the IMF sessions. What are the issues that most concern the global leaders?
Well, you know, I think I came away from both IMF and Davos disrupted, disheveled, just concerned, deeply concerned. And I apologize to everyone listening to this, because I believe in talking about promise, not just peril. And but yet I left Davos, and others asked me, Madam President, just like you are now, like, what was the elephant? What is the elephant in the room? And I said, the room is filled with elephants. It's literally packed. And the fog of the Ukraine war hovers over all the elephants, right? And below them, they're trampling on every known paradigm that we've relied on, including, by the way, Bretton Woods, for stability in the post-World War order. So, you know, end of war scenarios, absolutely. Oil and gas prices, commodities. Obviously, this hedging middle group of countries are the neutral countries. But inflation, supply chain, and global food crisis. I was just almost in tears thinking about that one.
Yes, and we will have the opportunity to talk about most of those issues. But let's start with COVID-19. COVID-19 and its variants are still around, and the risk of future pandemics is imminent. We know that you spent the last few years advising COVAX on vaccine distribution. What is your sense of the lessons learned from this global health crisis?
So first of all, you know, it was the most important, most fulfilling mandate of my career, and proud of our city team, proud of the relationship we developed with Gavi, and most important for me personally with Seth Berkley, the CEO. and that we did it pro bono, right? We put 29 people against the global vaccine distribution. So lessons learned. As you said, it is the chances that we have more variants is mathematically certain as it is that we will have another pandemic, and it's just a matter of time. So a couple lessons. One, you can't build the plane in the air through the storm of COVID or any other pandemic. You have to build it on the ground ahead of time, right? And we saw it coming. We did very little to get ready. You have to front load the money. One of the challenges we had in managing risk and execution was you're raising money at the same time. You've got to have contingent financing, right? We've got to, as we look at Africa and other places now, we've got to invest in absorption capacity, in distribution capacity, and further develop the healthcare infrastructure in the developing world. There is an ongoing fight which just has to continue against vaccine hoarding,
right?
Supply, oversupply absorption from the system that created a north-south problem. Vaccine nationalism. Extraordinary, and we saw that in India and elsewhere, and vaccine hesitancy, which we still see as this resistance around the world to vaccines, which means that there are a lot of the poorest countries in the world that are still kind of under the double-digit penetration rate. So to your point, though, Madam President, is we may think we're done with COVID, but it's not done with us. And if you're a low vaccinated population, we just should be assuming that there are variants and there are mutations that are happening, whether it's in China now, whether it's in Africa or elsewhere, and we have to be ready, and we can't let down our guard, because as Seth says over and over again, no one's safe till everyone's safe.
Yes, well, thank you. Let's touch on China. I have been one of the few persons allowed to enter that country during the last 2 years as part of the Olympic Games, because I am a member of the Olympic Committee. And they are still fighting the COVID-19 pandemic with zero tolerance policies and lockdowns. What do you think about the impacts of these policies on China's growth, and how it is impacting the global economy, and for how long, if we can, think about the future of this situation?
So, first of all, I think that is one of the biggest calls in the world now in terms of the future of the global economy and the externalities of inflation is where goeth China, right? But China went into or has gone into this series of lockdowns and the Shanghai crisis with all kinds of problems, right? We didn't start with this. We already started with an economy that had been hit hard across the board, SMEs on up from COVID. We started with reg tech issues, as you know, real estate market duress, with this Russia tilt and the politics of that, energy and price, food inflation, and the overall positioning of Xi for his next term. So this was already an environment where growth was dropping. And then we go into a zero lockdown policy. And I think what's happened in Shanghai is pretty unfathomable, and it's shaken a lot of people. But the biggest question now is how long, as you said, this lasts. And I just read, Nomura has moved their numbers down quite a bit. They had said that there were 370 some million people in lockdown in 45 cities. They're now talking about 130 million people in 16 cities. So this sense that we're finally coming out of that. But I had to, and I'm sure that you have as well, some conversations with Chinese, Beijing, Ren, talking about this district level lockdown policy that the Chinese party is implementing, where it's not the whole city, that their view is you can lock it down district by district and manage it better than Shanghai. Across the board, and that's the optimistic view. Quite frankly, the healthcare players, the pharma CEOs, they look at the vaccine efficacy of the Chinese vaccines and that they're not taking foreign vaccines, that's an issue. The subvariants, and I saw the numbers overnight from Hong Kong, kind of scary, but not surprising at all. And so to think that China will escape waves, that we won't have waves and that we won't have the spreading of the most transmissible of variants that we've seen more broadly, I don't know. But that really is the big call. And as you said, it's not just about the waves, but the bounce back will have an extraordinary implications for the global economy. So this current lockdown environment is impacting global growth and inflation. But to the degree that they do come out of it at the time, 18 months from now, where the greatest concerns are for global growth, that could actually be helpful. So this is, the billion-dollar question.
Yeah, well, you are totally right. Precisely one of the effects of this situation in China, but not only China lockdowns, but also the pandemics now, the war in Ukraine, is the problem with the global supply chain. Can you elaborate on the impact of disruption to supply chains and how much change and adaptation is actually underway? I imagine that was one of the major concerns during the Davos meeting.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for asking that question, because I do think the implications of this supply chain disruption are underestimated, and it's certainly not transitory disruption. I mean, this is just a pulling apart and putting back together of the supply chains that define trade in the world. So this is a complete rethink. And the prism isn't what, you and I grew up with of just-in-time, cost-driven supply chains, right? That was the dominant feature of how you decided to invest and trade. And you've now added a plethora of prisms, right? And that includes, of course, not just the shocks that we had with COVID in China and elsewhere, but this new geostrategic risk, right? And I think that deglobalization theme layered into supply chain is I call it the TGI impact, which is trade, growth, and inflation. Supply chains fundamentally affect all of that. It slows growth, slows trade, and increases inflation. And so as we unbundle and manage the geostrategic concerns in the boardroom, that's going to have a shock. And people are trying to interpret Secretary Yellen's comments, the Atlantic Council on friendshoring, right? A concept that goes beyond nearshoring, in terms of what that means for China's strategy, what that means for investment in a new construct of geopolitics in the world. And you add to that something that you and I have discussed, which is just the whole carbon emissions strategy, right? And this new move toward mandatory reporting of scope 3 by global corporates, material reporting. Wow. I mean, so if you're going to roll up product level emissions and you're going to hit your net zero target, and you have to think about how your supply chain and your choices between one country and another for M&A or FDI are going to impact net zero. Now I've thrown another prism in the room. And everybody, as you said, at Davos and elsewhere, you're just talking about this in the private equity world. You look at Cerberus and the Tracker Fund, which is investing in targeted dislocations. And you look at Palantir and others in the software space that are running AI models, pulling vulnerable components of supply chains out, putting them back in and seeing what the math of that looks like, trying to isolate the weakest link in a supply chain so that you don't have what we're seeing in Germany right now with the automobile sector and elsewhere of limited supplies that can shut down the whole chain. So yes, I think this will be an extraordinary rethink.
At the same time, in certain way, it becomes an opportunity for some other countries and economies. So let's move to the issue of the emerging markets. I am just coming from a conference on the state of emerging markets convened by the the Bank of France, the equivalent of the Fed in the United States. And the prospects, although there are opportunities, are not very promising for those economies, which are particularly affected by the very tough economic environment. What is your take on developing countries moving through this year?
So, first of all, I'd say one minister of finance told me recently that he was just exhausted, like they just got through COVID, and then all of this hits: food shocks, energy shocks, inflation concerns, and it is overwhelming. And when you look at the disruption of COVID, to go from that one storm to yet a bigger storm, I mean, it's hard to imagine a bigger storm. But I do think that monetary normalization, that process of monetary normalization, and we'll maybe talk about the Fed in a second, but that is so ginormous. I don't know if that's a word, but it can't not play out in the emerging markets with dollar liquidity withdrawal. Extraordinary rate differentials will be unbelievably painful. And I kind of see that this dollar liquidity was really signal numbing, right? All of a sudden we will open back this curtain of Oz as liquidity is withdrawn. And I think we will see macro fundamentals that we don't like, right? We will see this extraordinary debt to GDP shift upwards, and deficits and interest expense to revenue explosion. And none of that from a macro perspective or a debt sustainability analysis perspective within the fund is comforting. In fact, it points to solvency versus liquidity type problems systemically. And I look at the emerging markets and say, look, okay, 100 trillion of debt, let's call it 60-ish trillion of government, of EM govies in the market. And I did last night a little back of the envelope calculation of 30 countries that are basically out of the market. Either they have no choice, they can't access the market, or the price of that access is too painful and just isn't viable. I think I'm deeply concerned that will only get worse with time, and that many governments will be looking for the leadership of the world, as troubled as it is and as broken as Bretton Woods is. They'll still be looking to the fund, the World Bank, the G7 to jump in with new and creative solutions. So that is very much on the official community's plate, and they very much see it coming.
Thank you. Unfortunately,
I'm not sure you should thank me for that type of.
No. Of course. The problem is that you open many venues with each response that you give me, and so the temptation to ask about many issues is strong. So now I would like to move to something that is part of what you just comment on the global menaces in terms of macroeconomic stability, and that is inflation. What does this all mean for inflation and for the United States Federal Reserve? Do you believe in the Fed's ability to get inflation under control, and how it will impact the rest of the economies in the world?
Okay, so first of all, I don't think it's a question of if the Fed gets this under control. The Fed has no choice. I think it's a question of can you land the plane without crashing it, right? Can you have a soft landing? And 85% of the investors in the market right now think you're going to crash the plane, right? They're predicting that in 18 months we'll have a global recession, and so I think I was 22, 23 when I met Paul Volcker for the first time, and I thought he was a hero, right? I mean, he was just like godlike, and this Herculean challenge we have now will require Chairman Powell and the Fed and the central bankers of the world to manage through this storm, but perhaps even in a more complicated way. So first of all, it's not just about the Fed funds rate and where's the terminal rate, right? It's also about what are you doing with this $9 trillion balance sheet? And you're going to bring that down by, let's call it, at the run rate they're talking about, 1.1 trillion a year, right? That's never been done before. And when you start to suck that out and figure out how does that dislocate the system, how do we respond? That's the interaction with the Fed funds rate is tremendous. It's not only about how the equity market corrects as one transition mechanism that the Fed is using here, but all kinds of externalities and essentially known unknowns. I was with in Davos a central banker that said, look, you have to show confidence in the public domain, but in the private domain, we look at these externalities and all these variables. You've put in essentially a mathematical equation. You've put X, Y, Z, A, B, C into the equation. They're known unknowns, but they're unknown, right? So my sense is that the Fed has, I don't know, 2-3 months, let's say call it 3 months, where they're kind of on autopilot in terms of what the market expects and what they're going to deliver. But then you're going to go to visual flight rules, right? You're going to go manual. You're going to try to figure out what all these externalities mean and also what's happening clearly in the United States. I am not, on a personal level, not worried about shelter costs in the US. I don't think that's a huge component as the CPI 60%. But it's moving already. So I'm much more concerned about the labor market, right? I'm concerned about these numbers you hear of 6 million unemployed and 11 million unfilled jobs. Like, how do you close that gap? And so wage price inflation, fundamentally, how do you get that under control in a way that doesn't embed, right? That it doesn't entrench. It can't entrench. If it entrenches, Stan Fisher used to talk about squeezing the toothpaste out of the tube. It was pretty easy to squeeze it out, but try and get that toothpaste back in. Wage price inflation embedding can be a serious problem. So I think that fundamentally these externalities that the Fed will deal with, whether it's oil and food, as we'll talk about, or supply chains, China, but they will have to do it, and we just won't know whether we'll double dip like Volcker did, whether we'll go into a deeper recession, or for the first time in history, will they manage a soft landing?
Yes. Very hard decisions, very dilemmas right now, and most of the governments are going through the same kind of discussions that in the United States. Of course, I would love to ask about the political domestic consequences, but I will leave this for another conversation, probably after November this year.
Okay.
Okay, but there is another topic which is becoming more and more concerning. And in fact, today, before having this conversation with you, I had a meeting with representatives of the World Food Program. They are inviting me to be part of a kind of security advisory board, and that is one of the most pressing problems. You have already mentioned something about this. But why this is a crisis? Why this is happening in first place, and how it is developing according to your views?
So I'm so glad you mentioned the World Food Program. David Beasley is a friend, and I just had a chance to see him recently. But quite frankly, I don't think I was as visibly shaken as I was walking out of the room with David Beasley. Right? I mean, he's talking about before COVID, there were 80 million, if I've got my numbers right, 80 million acute malnutrition cases in the world. And he's looking now at going from kind of 270 to, let's call it 330 million people in acute food crisis, as he calls it, hell on earth. Right? Those are extraordinary numbers. So that's one. Second is, I think the most talked about city on the planet right now is not Shanghai. It is Odessa. And Odessa, I think, is, the Black Sea moves, I don't know, enough food to feed 400 or so million people in the world. And when that stops, that's going to reverberate not just through the Afghanistans and the Syrias and the Yemens of the world, the poorest countries, but it's actually going to reverberate, right here in the good old United States, and it's going to be a major problem. And two things that are kind of adding, let's just say, gas to the fire. One is we now have 27, the team counted this for me a couple of days ago, 27 countries with export restrictions in food already. So you're seeing, just like we talked about with vaccine nationalism, right? We've got food nationalism, and that can be very disruptive to the world. And it also it can create a tit for tat, so goeth Indonesia, then Indonesia, and then everybody else goes, well, if they don't sell me my food, I'm certainly shutting down. So I think that we're going to have to look. And I remember, Smoot-Hawley and how trade protectionism can trigger all kinds of unintended consequences that are, and in this case, you can trigger all kinds of bad things and suffering for the poorest of people on the planet, but also interactions between governments. And, this could make, quite frankly, the Arab Spring look mild. It'll look like patty cake. You can disrupt democracies and take the people in the street in Sri Lanka that are suffering from just not eating, and you can spread that even into the OECD, where people come out, and then it undermines the underpinning of the fundamental concepts of democracies if that happens. So again, it's just a call to say, act now, like put that up there like we did in the early part of COVID in 2020, where it just got prioritized and the world came together to figure out. And I think that we should be in that same mode right now.
Yes, well, you are quite right. People are just losing. They're getting more and more impassioned. And what we are seeing in many countries is a deterioration of democracy in general, but also, this growing discontent with democracy. And Latin America is probably one of the most interesting examples about what is happening. Now we have a new electoral cycle, so people are just waiting for some things to change, but the change won't depend solely of the local authorities. This is much more bigger, as you are mentioning. It is impossible not to mention in this chat the most relevant existential threat to humanity, which is the planetary changes, the climate change. I understand that you are spending a lot of time in Egypt working on climate finance with COP27 coming up at the end of this year. Share a bit about your thinking on COP27. What can we expect from this meeting?
Well, I would just say, personally, I think that this will be, first of all, a COP of implementation, right? Not just of new commitments. I think it'll be a COP of the emerging markets, a COP of Africa, not just the OECD. It'll be a COP of adaptation, not just mitigation, and a doubling down on adaptation. And certainly if you throw food and agriculture, water into that mix, the adaptation challenges are extraordinary. I think it'll be a COP of just transition, of just finance, and kind of that concept we have had of just transition is even more in the room now. If we look at the poorest of countries that are facing this tornado storm across the world on so many fronts, and to ask them then, when they are losing access to capital markets, to fund energy transition and climate, be it mitigation or adaptation, is a very tall order. So they've got the winds in their face, energy security. They're wrestling with biodiversity and adaptation, and how they fund all of this is the elephant in the room, right? For COP, for the Egyptians as they as they commit to find solutions and big and bold ideas to move this forward. I think that we'll see, given that the market, and I know you know this, that the market wants KPIs, right? The market wants outcomes. And as the official community and the private sector demand outcomes, I think we'll end up bundling loan products and bonds and grants, bilateral debt swaps, guarantees in and around outcomes. I call it outcome bundling. And I'm just, as sure as the day is long that this outcome trend and the need to mobilize more is huge. And we don't have time. This is we're going to have to simplify some of the KPIs around the NDCs, and we're going to have to scale and replicate more and mobilize more faster. And I look at this, this gray rhino that's staring us in the face, and it's going to charge. It's going to charge, just like you did with the pandemics, and yet we're. And by the way, it's going to feed into the food crisis, of course, with drought and with refugees and internally displaced people. So, this is one of the greatest, if not the greatest, challenge of our time. And I'm honored, and I know Citi is, to be trying to do anything we can at all to help the Egyptians and the COP process in the climate finance area.
Well, good luck with the conference. The world is eager of good news, so I hope that we can get some positive outcomes from that conference. Look, Jay, we are about to finish, but before, I would like to know, as you navigate all of these relevant issues, if you have a conceptual framework that guide you, kind of overarching view of the work. Can you tell us about this?
That's a tough one. I guess I'd say, I have big picture themes that I guess define me. Ambassador Abshire early in my life gave me this applied history framework, right? I don't believe that we can deal at all with the policy challenges of our time if you don't read history, right? History rhymes. And so you've got to look back at it, and as you look forward to what the solutions are. I believe in strategic miscalculations, and I think we just saw one. But you can look back in history, and whether it's Sarajevo in 1914 or the Maginot Line in 1940, strategic miscalculations, you don't plan to get the world into the boat we're in. And so you have to be able to know that they happen, and they may continue to happen in this crisis that we're, and the war that we see now. Unintended consequences. I look at this extraordinary economic sanction world that we're in, and I look back at the history of, you may remember the Ethiopia Mussolini sanctions and how they reverberated across the world into this sanctions phobia. Those are unintended consequences. So what are today's kind of conceptually, what are the unintended consequences of what we're doing? On a personal basis, I guess I'm anchored by patriotism. I think my father gave that to me. I believe in civility and humility and public discourse. I want to go back to the days, and I grew up in Washington in the 80s, and I believe in the national security domain, at least, that we should be able to have bipartisanship, right? That we should avoid these barbells of extreme right and extreme left that divide our country and our foundation. So I do believe in a liberal democratic order, belief in stakeholder capitalism that Jane Fraser, our CEO, has focused on in her commitment to net zero. So I believe in stakeholder capitalism. I believe in do good, do well models, and they're real, and that the private sector does have an incredible role to play in the challenges of our time. And of course, I wouldn't be, and I know Citi's leadership feels the same way. Certainly Jane does, that we wouldn't be committing to the COVAX world or to helping the Egyptian if we didn't want to stop and take a look at that gray rhino, both of pandemics and of climate change, and figure out what we do that's right, what we can do that can help the world. So that conceptually a little bit is how I see things.
Well, great. Thank you for sharing those very relevant
Personal.
reflections. And yes, of course, mostly for the young people who will watch this chat, I think it's very useful to listen to you, someone like you that have been involved in so many issues. I understand that you and me share something special. I don't know if did you graduate from Georgetown University, Jay?
Yes, well, I'm not undergrad, graduate. So I did the Master of Science in Foreign Service, the International Relations Master.
Okay, great. Yes, I graduated also from public policy.
We share that love of Georgetown.
Yes, we both at Hoyas.
Yes.
We also have been professors there, but you are still teaching. And I know that as part of teaching, mentoring is very important to you. Can you tell us who or what has most influenced you and your career?
Wow. So I guess there's so many people that I owe so much to. It's kind of hard to boil it down, but first, I think, as I said earlier, my father shaped my character. But I tell junior bankers, my students at Georgetown, kind of any junior that will listen, that probably the single most important thing for me in my career has been the role of mentors, is not necessarily picking the job or the institution or the next project you work on, but just working along someone of character and someone of success that you can aspire to look to. And my second father was really Dave Abshire. He founded CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, ambassador to NATO, advisor to a number of presidents, counselor to President Reagan. And I tell you, he shaped my conceptual view of the world from when we met as an intern until today. And fundamentally that conceptual, as you called it, conceptual framework is critical, but he took the time to guide me in extraordinary efforts of weekends and nights and phone calls saying, think about this way. And again, it deep values and character. Then Stan Fisher came along, and Stan joined Citi as a vice chairman and suggested to Bob Rubin that we create this public sector group at Citi. And he looked at it and he said, wow, you cover telecom and tech with industry specialists. Why don't we cover governments the same way? And Stan grabbed me, and you know what he did, Madam President? He reoriented me back to my roots of, I was covering corporates. Like I was a corporate and investment banker doing corporate work. And he started to ask me to get on a plane, go around the world with him and call on governments. And not only was I sipping water from a fire hydrant in terms of Stan's economic insights, just deep economic insights, but applied economic and finance to sit in front of a governor or a minister and make recommendations. So again, he pivoted me. And then finally, Jim Wolfenson. And I think Jim, before he passed away, spent so much time with me saying, you can't just work. You have to have a purpose. What is your purpose? It can't be 17 purposes. And so come back to me when you have a purpose and let's talk. So he said, look, I went back and I said, okay, I think children, it's children. And that's really been the construct, right? I could look at refugees as children and my work with Tent. I joined the Save the Children board, focused on children. I looked around and said, okay, and Jim urged me to teach. He said, you'll learn more from the young students than you'll ever learn from a tough client. And that is true. My graduate students, I don't know about you, but it's tough. I walk into that classroom on Friday nights and they're tough, but I learn from them and I feel like I'm somehow giving back. So that's that purposeful change that Jim gave me, amongst other things. And I've had the opportunity to write a little bit about what both Ambassador Abshire and Jim Wolfenson gave me on my LinkedIn page for those that are interested. But my only advice to young people is is to seek that mentor. And there's so many good people out there that will hold your hand and guide you through your youth.
Well, fascinating. Let me tell you that I think that I really owe my most important successes to my mentors, the mentors I had. I will never forget one mentor who once told me, look, Laura, always remember that the short and the long term start at the same time. In order to bring to me the importance of the long-term perspective and try to understand that whatever decision you take today will impact the future for your country, the communities of the people. Well, Jay, the temptation is big to continue with this conversation. It has been a pleasure talking with you. I hope that others will enjoy this conversation as much as I have. So once again, thank you very much.
No, thank you. And I look forward to working with you and others on the Leadership Council. And thanks for spending this time with me. Look forward to seeing you face to face soon.